Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the end of April here, 2021. Welcome to those who are joining live, and welcome if you are watching this recording. We're so glad to be here with you. As you know, our host, Glenn Grossman, is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. I'm thrilled to be moderating this conversation. My name is Rebecca Berman. Glenn, while pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years and taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and at UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology forecasting and advanced analytics with Bristol Myers Squibb, Sanofi, Novartis, Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, the Military Health Service, CDC, and other programs within the United States and abroad. All views expressed today are his own. Thank you to everybody who sent in great questions during the week. Glenn has built a robust conversation. If you have questions during tonight's conversation, please send them to me via the chat at the bottom of your screen. And of course, I will do my best to weave your questions into our conversation. Apologies in advance if I'm unable to bring your questions into our conversation tonight. I certainly will share those questions that we don't get to with Glenn, and we will circle back to those questions in next week's conversation. But as usual, tonight we will kick off the conversation. Glenn will give us an update on how things are looking here domestically and around the world.
Great, thanks Rebecca, and thanks everyone. I apologize we had to cancel last week's meeting at kind of the last minute, but I'm glad that everyone could rejoin us now. All right, so a lot's happened over the last couple of weeks in the COVID-19 world. So let me just, on a brief level, I'll just update where we are with the graphs and other visuals, but then let's dive into questions because there were a lot of great questions that have come in over the last couple of weeks. All right, so let me share my screen. All right, so here in the United States, what does it look like? There's around what, like 6 states here that are 6, 7 states that are still in the red, but I think pretty much across the board at this point, everything is getting better in the United States. That's not the United States. I want to show this first. All right, so here's the United States. Here's another glance. This is the total number of cases in the last 7 days adjusted for the population size of the states. So you can see that the dark ones, there's still some that are dark. However, when you look at this one, so this breaks it down on a state by state level. And so you can see that whereas New Jersey was continuing to climb up until a couple weeks ago, now it started a pretty sharp descent. And that's the same type of behavior that we're seeing in many of the states. So for instance, Michigan had been the leader in the United States, and you see that they're dropping very fast. So this is good news. The vast majority of this drop is simply due to the season. So we have realized that COVID-19 in most places is following typical flu and cold seasonality. And so we're at the tail end of the cold and flu season. And so the typical weather changes and behavioral changes that you see are apparent now. And so this is good news. Right now at a national level, you can see that we were, I guess the average of all the states together is the lines that you see. And now we're starting to see a descent. And that's, I think pretty much everyone expects that this descent is going to continue for the next few weeks. The big open question is not that, is this. So if you recall, last year, we had that first surge that ended in the Northeast around early June is when it mostly ended. And that hit the Northeast the hardest. It also hit the Midwest a little bit and the South and the West a lot less. But if you recall, last summer, the South got hit pretty hard, beginning at around mid-June with their surge. And so that's not the typical cold and flu season. The thinking back then was that that there were two primary reasons. One was that it was still the novel coronavirus, and so because it was so new, there was a lower threshold needed to infect people, and so it was just easier to spread during the summer, even though it was off season. And then the second hypothesis was that in the South, typically it becomes very hot and humid in much of the South, and so people actually spend more time indoors during the summer because it's air conditioned and drier. Whereas in the winter in the South, they tend to spend more time outdoors because it is more pleasant and it's more comfortable. And so as a result, that's what a lot of us were thinking for the surge. We don't really know for sure why the second surge occurred there. And so we saw it in the South and to a lesser extent in the West. So the big next question is going to be, will we see another surge in the South and the West in June, beginning in June? I think between now and mid-June, I think that the numbers are going to continue to drop quicker and quicker around the country, which is good news. With the one question being the variants that have now started to become more common, how is that going to impact? And also the continuing vaccination rates. How quickly are we going to continue to get people vaccinated? Those two open questions, but I think even just the seasonality alone is going to drop things down a lot. Now, so that's the United States. Globally, what we're seeing, this is vaccination. So globally, what we're looking at is a lot of countries are still doing very poorly. So Brazil in the Southern hemisphere, they have relentlessly been hit. We haven't really seen the seasonality that you would expect from cold and flu season. And in fact, one thing that we've been talking about for a couple of months now is that in Brazil, they thought that they had reached herd immunity back by November or so, or if not sooner, because so many people had been infected back then. But then what they realized was that a lot of people were becoming reinfected. And so there was no such thing as herd immunity because the new variants were emerging. And as people who had been infected were losing their immunoprotection, then it just kept on going. And so now you can see that in Brazil, it's just been a relentless ongoing attack. And in fact, when you look at it cumulatively, Brazil is continuing to rise. France, you can see, even in some ways worse than Brazil, and not very good shape right now. France tends to be vaccine hesitant in general, and so it's really that's not helping them in any way. Other countries as a whole, you can see how they've done generally. Generally, when you compare Europe, for instance, versus the United States, I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, that Europe was doing pretty well early on, but then they really have kind of missed the boat when it came to the vaccines, and they've not been vaccinating as rapidly as they should have been. I think that they're starting to ramp up some, but they're really not doing very well on that front. Yeah, so the United States, when we look at the cumulative confirmed cases, the United States and Israel are around the same. I just realized that we've sort of hit this point where we're kind of the same number of total cases. Israel has flattened their curve almost entirely because of the huge vaccination rate. So they have truly flattened the curve there, whereas the United States is not flattening. So we're going to continue to fly right past the levels that we're at now. All right, so let me talk about, so I talked about that at a glance. Let me talk about the vaccination rates. So you can see that the world leaders right now in the number of countries that have received at least one dose. In fact, it might be easier if I look at this as a map. So as a whole, you can see that there's a lot of the world that hardly has been vaccinated at all. And this is very problematic. Even in Brazil, which is being hit really hard, only around 12.5% have had at least one dose of the vaccine. In India, it's around 8%, 8.5%. So even worse than Brazil, have only that much has received at least one dose. The problem is that many of these countries had falsely assumed that if a large part of the population was naturally infected, that would mean that there was some sort of herd immunity that could occur. The problem is, as I've been saying for months now, I really don't think herd immunity is possible for this disease. particularly through natural infection. And so possibly if we were to vaccinate maybe 90% of the world population, it would be possible. But I really don't think that that's anything that's a reasonable expectation. And so we'll talk about this more tonight in terms of the questions of the flu and what will the future look like for us. All right, and so at a glance, that's it. I think I'm going to leave it there. Was there anything else I wanted to touch on tonight? Let me just take a look. So I've talked about that. It is really great that the numbers are starting to come down in these states so rapidly. So I think that the next few weeks, it's going to drop even further, and it's going to be really great news for us. If there was anything else, nope, this is for later tonight. Okay, yeah, so Rebecca, I'll leave it there as for that. Let's jump into the questions because there are some really great questions.
Okay, so to kind of continue on the point that you just made about, the future, what does the future hold? So for about the past year, the mayor of my town has been calling every Friday evening to give updates on the statistics of what's going on in my town. How many people have been diagnosed? How many people sadly have passed away? And then it shifted to how many individuals received the vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. And now last week, he decided to shift instead of weekly calls to now calls every other week. And so then I wonder when those calls will shift to once a month. And then I wonder when he'll decide to no longer make those calls, which signaled to me that perhaps this pandemic is now ending. And so how did the flu of 1918, how did that pandemic end? And how did those individuals know that that pandemic was over?
That is a good question. So I don't know if you remember this slide, but this is from almost a year ago. We discussed this slide. This was back in May 15th or around that week. And so this is sort of the history of pandemics around the world in terms of the size and the impact that they had on different populations. So this is over time. If you look back, the further away you are, that's the further in the past that it was. I kind of prefer this slide though, because it shows order of magnitude how it compares. By far, the worst plagues to ever hit the world was the Black Death. And this hit around the 1300s, 1400s, so 13th century, 14th century. So right around the mid 1300s, it hit the hardest though. And so around 200 million people died. As a rate, the world population was much, much smaller then. So this really hit the world population quite hard. Then after that, smallpox and Spanish flu were around the same. Although now we're calling it the flu of 1919. And so now the question is, how will COVID-19 end and how does this compare with the flu of 1918? So in fact, a lot of people don't realize this. The pandemic, the flu of 1918 never actually ended. So it's really interesting. Every flu season that we have, every pandemic that we've had since then is actually a descendant, sort of like we've been looking at the variants that have emerged from COVID. Every season, it's new variants that arise, and we call them the different strains that arise. And some of them, it's pandemic, some of them, it just kills a lot of people or causes a lot of sickness. But basically, there are 4 different kinds of influenza viruses that have been identified in the wild. They're called influenza A, B, C, and D. The ones that cause seasonal flu are influenza A and influenza B. Basically, the difference is in the nomenclature. And so I'll say this here. Basically, anything that is in the form HN, so for instance, when we looked at the avian flu H1N1 or HN, like H3N2, anything that's in the form that begins with H and N is part of influenza A. And anything that looks like these other lineages, B Victoria or B Yamagata, is influenza B. So now influenza A, this first emerged, or it's thought that it first emerged with the flu of 1918. There was no influenza A before the flu of 1918. So that means that every seasonal flu, whenever you hear of H1N1, for instance, the avian flu or the swine flu, all these things that came about, this is all a descendant of the original influenza A from the flu of 1918. So it still continues to hit us to this day. The original pandemic, I should have put a picture here, but I didn't. The original pandemic hit in 1918. It hit again in 1919, similar to where we are now. And then by the spring of 1919, most people assumed that it was pretty much over, that the pandemic had spent itself out and it was done. However, then there was another wave that hit in 2020 at the beginning, in the late winter there, early spring. I think it was more like late winter. And so early 2020, and that was a third wave. After that third wave, it pretty much died down. But the problem was, we don't know exactly why it died down, but we do know that a lot of strains emerged from that, because it's continuing through till today. And so what it could be, so for instance, what we're seeing now is that some of the offspring are much more contagious. And so if they're much more contagious, but less severe, then you might have had more asymptomatic cases or more spread with less severe disease, where it was just minor cold symptoms, where people were getting it maybe, but didn't realize that they were getting it. And so by getting hit with the less severe strains, perhaps that was blocking the infection from the more severe strains. And so as a result, less people were dying over time around that time. We don't know for sure exactly what was going on. It was quite a long time ago. A lot of the information we have has actually come. Some of the bodies from people who died were buried in permafrost. And so the permafrost kept people frozen for decades. And so scientists were able to go back and to dig up some of those bodies and then actually get samples from those bodies to actually figure out what the virus is, what it was. In fact, at the time, it's interesting, we didn't even know at the time whether the flu was a virus or a bacteria. We didn't realize that it was a virus until the 1930s. And in fact, the genomic sequences of the virus, so right now we're sequencing a lot of the virus, and we talk about it all the time, we didn't complete the genomic sequence of the flu of 1918 until 2005, just 15 years ago. And it took around 10 years to do the first mapping of that gene. Now we're doing it so rapidly, within hours we can look at the genes of the new virus, relative to where, I guess, the first genomic sequencing of COVID-19, when we first identified it, we'd already had a reservoir. We talked about this, that in Wuhan, they had been investigating this, the coronaviruses naturally. And so they had built up a reference dictionary of genomic sequences from lots of the coronaviruses that they had found. And so because they had this sort of reference dictionary, when we found the new coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, we were able to see that it matched really closely with one that had been circulating in bats for a while. So anyway, the long story short, the flu of 1918 never actually ended. It did dissipate. There was no official warning. So no one came out and said in 2020, it's officially over. It just was gone, and then people went on with their lives, and it was the roaring 20s, and people got back to partying and enjoying themselves. But yeah, every single influenza A up till this day is a descendant of that pandemic. So it's still hitting us. People are still dying from it today. And so what does this mean from COVID-19? So it means that we've seen that the variants are exploding like crazy. We know that there is variation in how well the current vaccines protect against the different variants. And so most likely what's going to happen is we're going to see variants that continue to change over time. And we're probably going to continue to see the seasonal variation, where some seasons we have an escalation in the amount of how contagious it is and how severe it is. And some seasons it's going to be less severe and less contagious. But ultimately what this means, because herd immunity will not be achieved, what this means, this is the key takeaway, is that pretty much everyone will become infected with SARS-CoV-2. at some point in the next few years. You either will become infected because you didn't take the vaccine, or you will have gotten the vaccine and hopefully it will protect you so you won't even have any evidence that you were infected because the antibodies will protect you. So you would have been infected, but the vaccines that were effective in your body provide immunoprotection, and so you're not infected at that point. But without the vaccine, if herd immunity cannot be achieved, then what that means logistically is that without herd immunity, there's nothing preventing you or anyone here out there from getting infected at some point. And we're going to let our guards down. People are going to stop wearing masks at some point, stop social distancing, and it's going to continue to spread like the flu. And so anyone who's lived any period of time has gotten the flu at some point in their life. It's very rare to not have ever gotten the flu. And even people who think that they've never gotten the flu have very well might have been infected and had asymptomatic infections and no symptoms. They didn't even realize they were infected. But without herd immunity, that's just the way this is going to turn out. And so I think that there are very few epidemiologists out there who at this point really believe that herd immunity is possible in any meaningful way. Let me qualify that by saying, because there is a seasonality to this, that means that at some points in the year, there's going to be less spread like we see in the flu. So for instance, in the middle of summer, in the Northern Hemisphere, when it's summer, there's just going to be a lot less SARS-CoV-2 spreading, typically is what we expect. And so in a sense, herd immunity will be achieved during that period of time. But then when the fall comes along and the typical cold flu season happens, we're going to see an uprise in the SARS-CoV-2 again, and coronavirus will spread again as well. So that's, let me show you just interesting thing to point out. So this is the flu every year. So the typical flu vaccine includes 3 or 4 different strains. They usually have one H1N1 strain, one H3N2 strain, because these are the most common. So they tweak it every year to get whatever is the most common version of these to try to protect from it. And then they'll either include 1 or 2 influenza B viruses to protect there. And you'll notice here, so this is from 2004. This is the seasons from 2004 through 2008. Green is the influenza B, and red was H3N2, so influenza A, H3N2. A was H1N1. And so notice the peak in 2007, 2008 was around 5,000 samples. I don't know what this looks like as a rate. 2009, when we had the H1N1 pandemic, here you can see the peak was over 12,000 during at one point samples. That was quite a lot more. This was the 2009 H1N1. One more thing I can say, as long as we're talking about this now, is because you might not see this again, and just in case you're curious, we've talked about the naming of the SARS-CoV-2 variants quite a bit, and we'll continue to talk about them. Flu also has a naming convention. So typically, the flu names look like this. The virus type, so if we're talking here about influenza A, then the place the virus was isolated, the strain number there, the year it was isolated, and then the virus subtype. And so this string of information is very specific to all the different strains that we see for flu. And so this is how virologists and epidemiologists communicate to each other about the flu, and there have been some interesting vaccine developments looking at flu, where they're hoping that we'll have the holy grail, where we're just going to have, we'll just need one final vaccine that provides protection against a lot of different strains, where you don't need to get hopefully a flu vaccine every year, but instead it will provide much more universal protection. We still haven't demonstrated efficacy and safety of a vaccine like that, but it is being investigated, and so we're very hopeful we'll find that. And hopefully even we'll find something like that for the coronavirus as well, but it's not yet there. All right, Rebecca, back to you.
Glenn, you certainly, you teach us so much. You teach us about these viruses. You teach us about how they're named. My goodness, you even touched upon the Roaring 20s. I thought, my gosh, maybe somehow you would dabble into fashion, and maybe you'd even be talking about some kind of like flapper outfits that might be coming back. Perhaps we should be thinking about that now, that perhaps no flapper outfits coming back, even though after this pandemic.
To talk about fashion, I think we'd need to talk to our other sister,
That's
who is
right.
not on the call, but I don't have any special insight about that.
That's right. Okay, so keep those flapper outfits tucked away. Okay, back to business. All right, so while we're talking about COVID variants, any updates since we last met on the variants?
Yes, so let me see. I apologize that this is so small. Let me see if I can make it any bigger. Am I going to break it? It's still kind of small. I'll just walk through it. So B117, that's what we were calling the UK variant. It's called the variant of concern again, because it is very contagious and more severe. Luckily, it is fully protected from the vaccines. In contrast, B1351 is the South Africa variant. It's less effective. The vaccines are less effective. However, they are still extremely effective against these variants. So it's not as effective as B117, but it's not the worst thing in the world either, where the immunoprotection is gone completely. That's something that a lot of scientists are fearing, that at some point variants will emerge and make our vaccines useless. And that is why we're fully expecting, at least on the short term, when we see these variants emerge, that we're probably going to need boosters depending on the variants that emerge and whether our vaccine shield holds, or whether we need to have a booster in the fall. The other ones we talked about are Brazil. The Brazil variants, there's two now, P1 and P2. Brazil is still burning out of control. And the fact that Brazil, a lot of people are being reinfected. Oh, and that's one other thing to mention. Among these variants in multiple countries now have seemed to demonstrate that they are able to reinfect people. And when they reinfect people, the disease may be more severe than the original infection. That's what we're seeing in Brazil. That's what we're seeing in India, and possibly in some other countries that we're looking at. And so the problem, and so what, but in contrast, people who are vaccinated do not appear to have the same risk as people who have been reinfected. So this is further demonstration that the vaccines are providing a better, higher quality protection and perhaps longer lasting protection than natural infection. So it's another reason for everyone to get vaccinated. Even if people were previously naturally infected, they need to get vaccinated on top of that, because the reinfection could actually make things worse for them. So vaccinations are really, really important for everyone who can at this point. I'll go through some of these others real fast, and then we'll open it up to the other questions. So you can see the California variants. The California variant is of interest because it is much more contagious. I don't think it's as much more severe yet, but right now the key thing that we're looking at is that it's 20% more contagious or more. Another one that's starting to emerge is a second one in the UK, also identified in Nigeria. This is B1525. This also has the E484K mutation, which again, we're looking at because it might make it, or we do know it increases the resistance to the vaccines. It makes it slightly more able to bypass the vaccines. Still, the vaccines do continue to provide some protection, but just not as much. Also with that is the B1526. They're similar in some ways. You can tell because of the initial preceding prefix, the B1, but they are different enough. B1526 and B1526.1 are very, very similar, as well as B1526.2. All three of those are occurring in New York City. We don't know a lot about the behavior, but the two mutations of interest that we've been talking about, E484K, again, which has been associated with the vaccine resistance, and L452R, which we're starting to talk about a little bit, which makes it more contagious. And then the last one here is India, B1617. We're going to probably hear a lot more about over time. This is B1617, and B1617 is sometimes error referred to as the double mutant strain, but in reality, all of these variants have lots of mutations, but sometimes it's an error called the double mutant strain. But the reason that they're calling it out is because if you'll notice, it has L452R and E484Q. So, and the two reasons, so it makes it more contagious and more resistant to reinfection. So it makes it more likely to be reinfected and more resistant to vaccine. But again, the variants that we're finding that are more resistant to vaccine, we're talking about a slight decrease or a meaningful but not complete elimination from the vaccine. However, with reinfection, the threshold is different because typically the vaccine, the antibody volume is not as high, and the antibody quality is not as good from natural infection. There's lots of other antibodies that are derived from natural infection that provide no immunoprotection and could cause some problems. And so the problem is that with a lot of people are being reinfected in India, and so it's causing some they're truly in crisis there right now, which we'll talk about in a little while. So before we move on to that, I'll just show a graphic here. So when we look at how the variant distribution has changed over time, you notice that even over the last few months, the B117 variant, again, that's the UK variant, has dramatically risen and now represents over half, or roughly half, of all the variants spreading around the country, so spreading around the United States. And it's also spreading a lot globally. But you can see that even as contagious as B117 is, you would think if it was so contagious, it would just sort of block the other variants, because if there was a few variants in a local community that were spreading and one was more contagious, then the more contagious one would spread first and then block the other ones from spreading. But yet, despite that, we're still seeing an increasing amount of spread of B1526, B1526.2, P1, again, that was the Brazil variant, and these others. So they are managing to compete against the UK variant, which demonstrates that these new variants are also very contagious and a lot more contagious than the previous variants were. What will be interesting will be, now that a lot of people have become vaccinated, what will the variant distribution look like then? Because you'd expect, with the shield of the vaccines, that if a variant is able to penetrate our shield and start replicating in vaccinated people, then that one may become, will sort of have an advantage and may become more common in at least vaccinated people and perhaps in the population as a whole. It depends how contagious it is in the population among people who are not vaccinated versus people who are vaccinated. And so there's a lot of dynamics in play we'll have to look at. But this is where we are now. You can see that the variants are really driving the story now. And so the variants, and again, the vaccines that we've been talking about. Everyone get your vaccine if you haven't. Everyone should be eligible at this point. If you're over the age of 16, probably within a matter of weeks, kids over the age of 12 will be able to get vaccinated if the emergency use authorization is given by the FDA. But a lot of us are expecting that will be the case. But you should be able to get your vaccine if you want it. So please, please don't hesitate now. Go and get the vaccine. All right, Rebecca.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience. Mark, if you could please unmute. The question is regarding prior infection and adverse reaction to the vaccine.
Yeah, thanks. I got to get that in front of me. All right. Glenn, is it true that adverse reactions to the vaccine often come to people who have had the virus not long before getting the vaccine?
So by adverse responses, are you talking about the typical feverish feeling after someone has a vaccine? Or are you talking about more severe symptoms that are not the typical vaccine responses?
Yeah, I would. Well, more the typical. I think we have a family member that had really had a rough time with it, but I guess just more general, that it would be kind of like what you've heard other people, especially the younger ones, that had the chills and the swollenness and a lot of those symptoms.
Yeah, so typically people who were previously infected they have symptoms on their first vaccination that are more typical of people who are not previously infected that they would have on their second vaccination, just because they already have been previously exposed. And so the body, the reason we have these symptoms is that the body is mounting an immune response because it thinks it's under attack from the virus. And so the typical fever, chills, these other flu-like symptoms are the body thinking it's under attack again and trying to marshal a response. And so that's the typical response that you'd see within the first few days. There are other immunoresponses that are not seen as nearly as often, but the immune system is complicated. So there's some early things that happen within the first 24 hours to 48 hours of the vaccination. Then within a few days to weeks later, there are other immunoprocesses that come into play. So some people might feel a little bit more fatigue over that time, but it's not as common after that. So if you're talking about the typical flu-like symptoms that happen within the first 24, 48 hours, that's maybe as many as 3 days after the vaccine. That's somewhat common, unfortunately.
So is there a time that people, if they've had COVID, is there a time that they should wait until they get the vaccine?
So typically the CDC's guidance is that people should wait until their symptoms go away. So if someone has an acute illness and then their symptoms would typically subside within around 6 to 10 days, then at that point they are fine because then they're no longer contagious. They can go and get the vaccine at that point. However, I don't know if it was simply due to trying to maximize the effect of the dose, or simply because there wasn't a lot of vaccine available, and people who were infected were assumed to not be able to be reinfected for around 3 months after that initial infection. So a lot of sites were limiting who, if someone could get the vaccine if they had been previously recently infected, to 90 days after that infection, so that 3-month period. However, there's no necessary reason that has to be the case. It was more just the decision of those sites. And according to the CDC, as soon as someone's symptoms have subsided from an acute infection, they can get the vaccine. It's just fine.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Glenn. Okay, so let me just pull up this question here. Okay, Dr. Jankowski, you had a question about a report in the news recently about the vaccine may not be as effective in a particular population. If you could please unmute to ask your question, that would be great.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So first, thank you, Glenn, for all your time and effort in this.
Thank you.
Anyway, there was a report this week in the newspaper about people who are immunocompromised, that the vaccine is not effective or not as effective. I know people with taking Remicade, which I know is used in Crohn's, they say that's not effective. So there's a lot of people on those drugs and a lot of people who are immunosuppressed. So what should these people be doing since the vaccine, how can they test if the vaccine's effective, or what should they be doing differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So right now, immunocompromised. So originally in the clinical trials, I don't think that they looked at the vaccine in immunocompromised people, if I recall. I'm gonna have to follow up on that. But it's not currently a contraindication. So people who are immunocompromised have been getting the vaccine. But you're right, this is not just from the COVID-19 vaccine. People who are immunocompromised what that technically means is that they aren't able to marshal an immune response that's as effective as other people. And that's part of the point. Like people who have autoimmune disease or rheumatoid arthritis or some of these autoimmune diseases, the point of therapy is to reduce the immune response because the body's attacking itself. The problem is that when you reduce the immune response, then that means that the vaccines are less effective generally because you need an immune response to respond to this stuff. So what it means is a couple of things. One is, yeah, it has been looked at. Typically the titers that I've seen are much lower than people who are not immunocompromised. So this is potentially problematic. Two, one thing that's being investigated in these populations, we've talked about this before, are the monoclonal antibodies. So right now, the monoclonal antibodies have been investigated if people and given emergency use authorization for people who are exposed to SARS-CoV-2 and either know that they've been exposed and want to take the monoclonal antibodies to prevent severe disease, or among people who test positive for the virus and don't yet have very severe disease. Those people, particularly if they're at high risk for severe disease, have been taking the monoclonal antibodies, which have been very effective if given early enough in the infection stage. So one thing that's being investigated is the use of these prophylactically. So giving them to people who haven't even tested positive or haven't even been exposed, because if they stay circulating in someone's system for 3 months, then guess what? You maybe don't even need to worry about the vaccine. Just get this shot once every 3 months with the monoclonal antibodies, and you'll have sort of this passive immunity because you'll have the antibodies floating around your body without even having to develop them yourself. Still, that's kind of annoying to have to take the shot once every three or 4 months. I guess it would be quarterly, or depending on how long it persists. And so there are clinical trials looking at a version of monoclonal antibodies that are polyclonal, depending on the different therapies that we're looking at, where they would be given once every 6 months or once every year. So it would almost be like a vaccine at that point. You would go to your regular, although currently they're in an infusion form. It's not a typical shot like a vaccine shot. So that would make it a little bit more complicated, although a lot of these immunodrugs are also infusions rather than shots. So for people who are immunocompromised, going once a year to get an infusion would probably not be the worst thing in the world. And if it gives them the same protection as if they were vaccinated, I think a lot of people would be motivated. I think that we're probably going to be hearing about the results of those clinical trials probably within the next month or two. I don't know at what stage they're at yet, but I'm expecting them to read out pretty quick.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. All right, Rebecca.
Okay. Thank you for all these great questions from our audience. Always so engaged. Okay. So let's move on here. Just this week, the FDA made a decision to pause the J&J vaccine. Well, that was this week, yes? Or was that last week? I've lost track of the days here.
2 weeks ago.
Okay, 2 weeks ago, it was paused. And now the J&J vaccine is back on the market. Is it safe? And what have been the consequences of this pause?
Yeah, so this is a really tricky question. So here's the big story. So if you recall, back on I think it was April 13th is the date here, is when they originally announced the pause. And so basically, this came after AstraZeneca's vaccine that was being used widely outside of the United States, which was similar to the J&J vaccine, similar. And so there was what they had identified in Europe was that there was an elevated risk of this very, very specific type of blood clot, not all blood clots, just a very, very particular subtype of blood clot called CVST. And this is a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. And in particular, it's seen in combination with people who have low levels of blood platelets. This is called thrombocytopenia. And so CVST with low blood platelets puts people at very high risk of severe illness or death. And so this is a concern, but it's really, really rare in the public. And it's also rare among vaccinated people. However, the risk was there some, the worry was is there some elevated risk? What they found after this review in J&J, which was very similar to the numbers they were seeing with AstraZeneca, was that around 2 out of every 1 million people were getting this risk who were vaccinated. And that's rare, as you can see. 2 out of every 1 million people were getting this if they were vaccinated. In contrast, the normal expected number, so among people who are not vaccinated, this disease typically, or this event typically occurs in 1 out of every 1 million people. So that means that there's an additional risk if people are vaccinated, that's 1 in a million, order of magnitude, roughly 1 in a million people. And so the question is, what should the FDA have done? Should they have paused it? Should they have investigated or not paused it? Here's what they ultimately decided. So based on they paused it and made this review. Ultimately, there were originally 6 people out of the 6.8 million doses administered. There were originally 6 reports of this rare blood clot. Then, based on their review, they found some more. They found 9 more for a total of 15 cases. And so these occurred almost all in women between the age of 18 and 59. And so I think that it says here they were all in women, but I think that there was 1 found in a guy, but it's almost all in women. But so the question was, should they constrain who gets the vaccines? And we realized that a lot of places where people are going to get vaccinated don't have multiple vaccines available. It's only 1. And so if we made the constraint, then that whole site would not be able to vaccinate a whole swath of people if we prevented them. And the risk, 1 in a million, is not a huge risk. It's really low. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the decision was made. Let me go to this slide. The decision was made. I guess the analysis was first done. Okay, say that they were to release the J&J vaccine and everyone in the population were to use it. So we would stop giving the mRNA vaccines and only use the J&J vaccine, just for the sake of argument, to see what the results would be. If we did this for everyone who has not yet been vaccinated, then we'd assume that based on this vaccine, there would be 26 to 45 more cases of this, just this very, very rare clot. But the benefit would be that we'd avert an additional 1,400 deaths and an additional 2,200 ICU admissions. So even under this extreme situation that everyone got vaccinated, that there was no mRNA vaccines, there's the benefit would hugely outweigh the harm. Secondly, we said, well, what if we limit it to adults only over age 50? And under this case, there was still benefit. So you'd expect under this, there'd be 2 to 3 more cases of this type of blood clot, but then you'd avert 257 deaths and 779 ICU admissions. So ultimately, this is what it would look like. But based on these numbers, the benefit is so overwhelming and the harm is so rare at the population level. 1 in a million is really rare, that it was decided that there were 4 options here. The 4 options that the FDA could have gone with was to either 1, recommend against use against all people. So fully eliminate it, don't let anyone use the J&J vaccine. The second option was to recommend for all people, but put a warning label on it. So anyone can now resume using it, but just put a warning label on the label so that people know. And if they decide not to get the vaccine, knowing the risks, then that's their choice. And then 3, recommend only for people over the age of 50. So prevent people under the age of 50 from being allowed to take it. Or 4, reaffirm the use, the recommendations for use, but be much more specific, that it would be women aged under 50 who would not be allowed to use it, or maybe make it more specific. Ultimately, what they decided to go with was number 2, recommend for all people, but put a warning on it. Now, the reason this is important is because the J&J vaccine, if you recall, was unique, and that only 1 shot is necessary. And the reason this is important is because we are finding that millions of people have not yet gone back for their second dose. So millions of people should have gone back for their second dose, but haven't yet. Either they decided they don't want to go back at all, or they decided that they were maybe postponing it a little bit and they just haven't gotten around to getting the second shot. Either way, the ability to only need to take 1 shot is so important for a lot of people that this is going to really be an important part of the arsenal going forward. The other thing that we found is that among people who are not getting their second shots, a lot of them seem to be in, I guess I'll talk about this in a second, but a lot of them seem to be in rural areas in some specific states. And so we want this vaccine to be available in those places so that people only need the one shot and we don't have to worry about them getting a second shot. Now, so this is the answer to that. There's no real big issue in terms of risk. However, there is an issue in terms of vaccine hesitancy now, because now, based on the pause, a lot of people are now worried increasingly that the vaccines are unsafe, because if there was this pause where we were communicating the vaccines are safe, don't worry, and then there was a need for a pause that it really made a lot of people more worried that maybe the scientists didn't know what they were talking about, that we have sort of this science juice and we're giving vaccines with the science juice to lots of people. We don't really even know what's going on. And in reality, from my perspective, the fact that we caught this issue when the risk was 1 in a million means that if other things are going on, it's probably going to be even less risky than 1 in a million. Say we were to find in a month or 2 months that there was some increased risk of something that we didn't know about, but it turns out, yes, there's an increased risk if you got the mRNA vaccine. Based on the information we have now, we know that that risk is likely to be much less than 1 in a million, because our filters for catching this is at the 1 in a million level. That's what triggered the pause for J&J. So we know that these drugs are even safer than we thought that they are. So this is really good news. But the vaccine hesitancy is really a problem, that we're seeing these large numbers of vaccine hesitancy. We don't know how it's going to play out over the next weeks and months, but the government has to really pivot, not just in the United States, around the world, to really fighting vaccine hesitancy. What we're finding is that there are regional distributions in terms of vaccine hesitancy that are becoming very, very apparent at the county level, even, that there are some hotspots of vaccine hesitancy, and we are going to have to find really strong ways to incentivize people in these areas to go and get vaccinated. And so we haven't really figured out how to unlock that yet. We've been talking about sticks and carrots. I don't know how likely it is that the federal or state or local governments are going to be able to tell people and just make a mandate that people get vaccinated, particularly as long as the vaccines are still under emergency use authorizations. They haven't been given full authorization yet. At some point, they probably will be. Seems like, based on the evidence we've collected, they will, or I guess I'll say they would have met the requirements. Part of the requirements is to track people for an amount of time. And so the months of tracking still need to go on. But having said that, when you compare COVID-19 symptoms and consequences, including death, but not just including death, versus COVID-19 vaccine consequences, there is no comparison. In fact, that was another question that we had. Maybe we can end with that, is looking at the consequences after people have fully recovered from COVID-19. Are there any additional health risks? And there are additional health risks, whereas COVID-19 vaccine does not have those. So that's important.
Go to that question.
All right, so we'll jump to that. I saw you had a question about masks. I don't have a good answer now, so I'll have to bump that again till next Sunday, and I'll have some really good information now. I know that there was a meme over the last week, I think, that came out saying that, oh, masks, we don't have any good information about masks, and it's all silly. We do have great information about masks, but I haven't had time to summarize it all in a set of slides. And so as a result, I really want to be able to put it in and communicate it very well in a few slides, and I haven't had that time yet. So let me bump it. But
thank you, Mark. Yeah, and thank you, Mark, for asking last time we were together and reminding us on that. I know Glenn had touched upon that a while ago when some early studies had come out comparing the different kinds of masks that were out. And so now that we're well into this pandemic, certainly there's a lot of research out there. So I know Glenn wanted to digest that for us and come back to the group. So thank you, Mark, for bringing that up. And Glenn, thank you for coming back to us next week with that detailed analysis. So we will circle back on that. And Glenn, thank you for coming back to this question that you were going to end with now on long-term consequences.
Great. And let me just punctuate that one more time. Within the epidemiology community, there is no controversy about masks. This is not something that people are arguing about. This is literally just memes on Facebook or whatever, where people are questioning the sum of evidence. So I'll get into this. I'm enthusiastic to get into the sum of evidence supporting how effective masks are in places in which they're more or less effective, and to really get into the weeds there. But I just don't have a good setup yet for that. All right, let me jump into the what I was going to talk about here. There are a lot of really important questions that we'll have to postpone until next week here. But let me talk about this one. Let me see if I can find it real quickly. And that is this. All right, so the question, before I look at the slides too much, the question here is, among people who were infected with SARS-CoV-2, they had COVID-19, and then they fully recovered. 6 months after they had it, are there any changes in their health or mortality? And so this was the first study that's really investigated this. It looked among people who are in the VA, so the Veterans Administration. People who are veterans tend to have a different risk profile in general. They tend to be poorer. They tend to have more complicated health histories and higher risk profiles in general for things. But despite that, what they were comparing here was they had two sets of comparisons. One set was looking at people who had COVID-19 6 months later and comparing them to Veterans Health Administration people in general. And then they were looking at hospitalized people with COVID-19 6 months later after they were done, and comparing them with VHA people, so people with the Veterans Health Administration who had been hospitalized for flu. So you would think if someone was hospitalized for flu in the VHA and they were hospitalized with COVID-19 in the VHA, that they would be very similar types of patients. And so as a result, this was a really interesting analysis. And so let's jump into it real quick. I know that we're running out of time here. So the first thing is they found that people who had COVID-19 6 months later were around 60% more likely to die 6 months later after COVID-19 was over, after their COVID-19. 60% is huge. And this is still stayed high even when you compared to flu. I know earlier in the year, back in March of, or not this year, but back in last year, March, April of 2020, a lot of people were saying, oh, this is just like the flu, we don't need to worry. And yet when you compare it to the flu, even people who had gotten COVID-19 and then 6 months later comparing them, what we find was that people with COVID-19 were 50% more likely to die 6 months after. So this is huge. And so now let's just jump into why people were dying 6 months after they were done with COVID-19. And so the reasons are, they looked at this in a couple ways, and I'm going to go through. There were too many interesting slides, so I'll just run through them here. But basically, what they looked at were a few different types of things. One was increases in different diseases. So for instance, one thing that they found, first, let me, before I jump into the conclusion, I'll jump into what we're looking at here. So on the left, these are different types of diseases. So for instance, cardiovascular disease, blood clots, so coagulation diseases, skin diseases, dermatologic, endocrine, etc. They looked in 3 different populations: people who tested positive versus people who are hospitalized versus people who were hospitalized but then were put in the intensive care unit. So these were different measures of severity. And what they found was the more severe disease, the more likely they were to have a new disease 6 months later. And so this is looking here, we're looking outcomes 6 months after they had been in intensive care or hospitalized for COVID-19. All right, so what they found here is that people who were, so acute coronary disease, this is a serious disease. A coronary event is frequently associated with this, and you'll notice. So at 6 months later, people who had been in the ICU, after they'd been released from the ICU and had no longer had COVID-19, were much more likely to have a heart attack or acute coronary disease. In addition, they were more likely to have arrhythmias, slow pulse, tachycardia is fast pulse, heart failure, so more likely to be diagnosed with a heart failure 6 months later, a blood clot, much more likely. But if you look, it's not just any of these, it's almost universally, they were much more likely to have hair loss, dermatology, diabetes. You wouldn't expect it, but people who had COVID-19, particularly severe COVID-19, 6 months later were more likely to then have diabetes. So these were people who did not have diabetes before COVID, but then they got COVID-19 and then 6 months after were diagnosed with diabetes. This is crazy. And so what this means is that COVID-19 is the gift that keeps on giving. After people recover from COVID, they're at high risk for a host of other illnesses. Now, the overall risk is, depending on the person and depending on the severity of the disease, is going to vary. But this is the first study that's really demonstrating to us that this is something we're going to need to be following very closely, because it's very worrisome. All right, so this is the first slide that I'm showing you here. And so I've shown you some, I talked about some of the things here. Some of these diseases are more serious than others, but you'll notice that there's a wide range across lots of different disease areas. So you see here kidney, mental health, musculoskeletal, neurologic, pulmonary, breathing types of things you might have imagined, respiratory, because it was a respiratory, or originally seen as primarily a respiratory illness. But let me look at some of these other things here, and then we'll call it a night. But this is shocking, that it's not one and done. You don't have COVID-19 and then it's over. You have COVID-19 and there are persistent things going on in the body that we weren't even aware of, even after the symptoms resolve. What was interesting about this one, was this what I wanted to, no, let me jump to figure 3. All right, figure 3. So this is comparing people who had been hospitalized for COVID-19 versus people who had been hospitalized with the flu. One means, so down here is this x-axis. The further to the right it is, means the more this was found in people with COVID-19 versus people who had the flu, had been hospitalized with the flu. If it's a 1, then it means it was exactly the same. For almost all of these things, the normal expectation, the normal idea would have been flu. So the flu typically is a very inflammatory event. So that means that if you have the flu, it increases your risk of heart attacks and strokes and blood clots and lots of other inflammatory events. And so you'd expect that COVID-19 would be similar to the flu and that it would be inflammatory. And so you would expect it would all be very similar to 1. But yet COVID-19 is not similar at all to the flu, and that you can see how much more this is. So they looked at 3 things in this study. One was they were looking at new diagnosis of diseases. So this is not just an additional diagnosis. Instead, this was new diagnosis where the person hadn't been diagnosed with this before. So for instance, hypotension was found much more. So again, these are patients who did not previously have hypotension, but then they got COVID-19, and then months later they were found to have hypotension, much more than people who had flu. And so there was something specific about COVID-19 that's causing this. It's actually not super surprising to people who have been thinking about the details here. We know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus infects the ACE2 receptor, and the ACE2 receptor is involved in hypotension and hypertension and some of these other disorders. And so it wasn't so unexpected, but yet seeing the evidence in real world data is worrisome, that even months after we're seeing such big impacts. It also has a lingering effect in terms of if someone's more likely to get infected with other infections after, if they're going to be anemic, if there's clotting or hemorrhage, so clotting or bleeding disorders. There's a lot of disorders like this, so these diseases. In addition to looking at the diseases, they also looked at whether new medications were prescribed. And so medications might be prescribed and might be a better way to capture this information. So maybe the doctor wasn't very good at putting the diagnosis in the medical charts, but the fact that they gave the patient a new treatment demonstrates that they thought something was going on that we should be aware of. And so even if you're not looking at diagnoses, sometimes there's misdiagnoses or misclassification in diagnostics. When you look at treatments, typically that tends to be a little bit more accurate. And again, with the treatments, you see a lot of new treatments that were given that would correspond with what you would expect for these diagnoses. Then the third thing they looked at was lab results. And when you look at lab results, again, so C-reactive protein, again, this is an indicator of inflammation in the body. And so you see a lot more CRP months after a person recovered from COVID-19. And also, again, this is compared to the flu. Flu also raises the CRP level, the C-reactive protein level, a marker of inflammation. But COVID-19, it's way more. It looks like it's 70% to almost 2 times as much in people who had COVID-19. Troponin is interesting. This is frequently seen as a marker of heart damage. So someone might have a heart attack and you don't know, maybe they had mild symptoms. And so frequently what a physician might do is they'll do a lab test for troponin, and then this might be a way of checking to see if they've had a heart attack or not. And so this troponin level, it's not just caused by the heart, it's caused by other muscle issues. So it could be released from other kinds of muscle damage, not necessarily just the heart, but frequently the heart is a cause of this troponin. But troponin levels have increased 4 times. I mean, there's a wide range around this, but it's 2.5 to as much as 6 times as much in people who had COVID-19 versus people who had the flu. So this is huge. COVID-19 is the gift that keeps on giving. And so what this means is that even after someone recovers from COVID-19, they really need to be hyper concerned about ensuring that they are doing healthy behaviors. So that means not smoking if they were smoking before, and maybe thinking more about the exercise, working with their physicians to make sure that they are living as healthy a lifestyle as they can. Maybe looking to take treatments for things that they hadn't thought about before, because they might be more likely to be candidates. So maybe they hadn't thought about seeing the physician as often. Well, guess what? Maybe after COVID-19, if they've been infected, they should see the physician a little bit more frequently, maybe every few months, just in case there are things going on, and they should have some of their lab tests done. Maybe they don't get some of these lab tests done as frequently. And so for those people who had previously been infected with COVID-19, it might be a good idea to get some additional labs done that they hadn't gotten done, just to be aware if there's any lingering issues going on in their body after COVID-19. So as a whole, it's the fact that it's not just any one disease, but it's an enormous level of different diseases that we're identifying. This is very disconcerting. And so we really need to be keeping an eye about this. That's the big takeaway here. We've already gone over, there's some other things that we could have mentioned, but that's the big takeaway here is what I mentioned, that this is at a high level. This is something we really need to be worried about. It could be part of the reason, this is just a hypothesis I'm throwing out. When we talk about reinfections and the fact that people who are reinfected are sometimes getting more severe disease, it could be because people have this lingering issues going on. So even after they lose immunoprotection from the virus itself, their antibody protection starts to fade. When they are reinfected, if you have already high inflammation because of the C-reactive protein as an indicator and these other things that are going on, it looks like it's strange. Even cholesterol levels seem to be getting higher. Then this would be something to be worried about. Now, there's one caveat here, and the one caveat is that people who are at higher risk for COVID-19 in either infection or for severe disease might have already been at higher risk of, say, getting diabetes or getting some of these diseases. So another way of saying this is, say someone had metabolic syndrome, and metabolic syndrome was a risk factor for having severe COVID-19 if someone got infected? Well, because they also had already had metabolic syndrome, then that was sort of a confounder, because what it means is that it wasn't the COVID-19 that caused their increased risk for diabetes. They already had the pre-existing risk factor, but that pre-existing risk factor both increased the risk of COVID-19 and increased the risk of diabetes. So it wasn't the COVID-19 that was doing it, it was the risk of diabetes. However, what they tried to do by comparing it to flu, being hospitalized with the flu, is that we imagine that people who are at high risk for diabetes, that also increases their risk for high risk of being hospitalized for the flu. And so they were trying to address this confounding by having this reference group of using seasonal flu, and particularly hospitalization with seasonal flu. I think that this was a really good approach. It might not have been perfect, so that might be one caveat. But having said that, the fact that COVID-19 is so much more impactful on all of these different diseases and therapeutics, for me, means that there's very likely to be a real signal going on, but this is something that needs to be evaluated further. Are there any follow-up questions on this specific issue tonight? Otherwise, we can call it a night. Or any other questions that we should postpone for next week, Rebecca?
I think we'll leave it at there. We'll leave it there. I, for one, am glad that you did not give us a pop quiz tonight, Glenn, as you have in the past, because you shared lots of good data, as you always have. And your pop quizzes tend to be excellent. But stay tuned, everyone. We may get a pop quiz in the future. So, but I know this audience is always on its toes. So we look forward to being together, same time, same place. Keep those questions coming. I know they're very, very helpful. Mark, Glenn, as he mentioned, will address the mask question next week. So thanks for bringing that up again. And everybody else, please send your questions in during the week or share them as we're together next Sunday, same time, same place. Stay safe, everybody, and we'll see you next Sunday. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.